I retired 8 months ago, 26 years with the Dayton Police Department, starting as a patrol officer in '99, finishing as a senior detective in the Major Crimes Unit. I worked homicides, missing persons, assaults, robberies, the full catalog of what people do to each other when they think nobody's keeping score. I've been shot at twice. I've pulled a dead infant from a bathtub. I've sat across the table from men who killed their wives and watched them eat a sandwich while they described it. I'm telling you that so you understand. I am not someone who scares easily. I've spent more than half my adult life walking into situations specifically because they're dangerous, because someone has to. And I was the someone with a badge and a radio. Fear is a tool in that line of work. You learn to use it the way a carpenter uses a level. You note it, you calibrate against it, and you keep building. But there were calls that didn't work that way. Calls where the fear didn't calibrate, where my training, my experience, the thousands of hours of knowing exactly what to do in any human situation simply didn't apply. Because what I encountered on those calls wasn't human. I don't mean that metaphorically. I don't mean it was inhumane or cruel beyond comprehension, or monstrous in the way people call serial killers monsters. I mean it wasn't human. And the thing that keeps me awake now, the thing I'm sitting at this desk trying to explain to someone before it's too late, is that I think it used me, all 26 years of me. Every shift, every case, every observation I ever made, and every private thought I ever had standing alone in a dark room. It was taking notes, and now it's done. I need to tell you about 5 calls. They span my whole career. At the time, I thought they were separate incidents, unrelated weirdness in a job that generates plenty of weirdness. It wasn't until the last one, on my second to last shift before retirement, that I understood they were the same thing. The same event playing out over decades with me at the center. Not because I was special, because I was useful. The first one was in October of 2001. I'd been on the force about 2.5 years at that point. Still on patrol, still riding with the training officer, even though I was technically cleared to go solo. My TO was a guy named Rich Pellegrino, a 20-year veteran, built like a fire hydrant. The kind of cop who'd seen enough that nothing surprised him, but not so much that he'd stopped caring. Good man, good cop. He retired in 2011 and died of a heart attack in 2014. I think about Rich a lot these days, mostly because I wish I could tell him what I'm about to tell you. I think he'd believe me. He was there for the first one. We got dispatched to a domestic disturbance call on Wellspring Avenue, which was a mostly residential street on the east side of Dayton. Lower middle class, the kind of neighborhood where people kept their lawns mowed and their problems private until they couldn't anymore. Caller was a teenage girl, maybe 15, 16. Her name was Amber Lacefield. She was crying on the phone, saying her mother needed help, that there was someone in the basement, standard call. We'd done a dozen like it that month. Rich drove, I rode shotgun, and we pulled up to a 2-story frame house with a porch light on and the front door open. The girl was standing in the doorway with her arms wrapped around herself. Her mother was behind her, one hand on the girl's shoulder. The mother, Diane Lacefield, was calm. Too calm, I thought at the time. But you learn not to read too much into how people present during a crisis. Everybody processes differently. Amber told us what happened. She'd been in her bedroom upstairs doing homework. Her mother was in the kitchen. At some point, she heard her mother's voice calling her name from the basement. Not yelling, not distressed, just calling her. The way you'd call someone down for dinner. Amber, come down here. She got up, went to the basement door, and opened it. The light was off, she called down, and the voice called back, come down here, honey, I need to show you something. Amber said she started down the steps, got about 3 steps in, and then her mother appeared behind her in the kitchen and asked what she was doing. Her mother had never called her. Her mother had been in the kitchen the entire time, making dinner, with the radio on. She hadn't spoken a word in 20 minutes. Amber panicked. Diane locked the basement door and called 911. By the time we arrived, about 14 minutes later, nothing else had happened. No more sounds from the basement, no more voices. Rich and I cleared the house. Standard procedure, I went to the basement, Rich covered the main floor and worked upstairs. The basement was unfinished. Concrete floor, cinder block walls, One bare bulb on a pole chain, a water heater, a washer and dryer, some storage boxes. I checked every corner. Behind the appliances, inside the utility closet, nothing. No sign of entry, no open windows, and no disturbed dust. The basement door leading outside was padlocked from the inside. I came back up and told Diane and Amber that the house was clear. Rich confirmed the same for the upper floors. No one was in that house who shouldn't have been. Amber was insistent, almost frantic. She kept saying she heard it, her mother's exact voice. Not a recording, not a TV, not sound carrying through ductwork. Her mother's voice coming from the basement, using her mother's specific inflection, saying specific things. Diane was harder to read. She wasn't dismissing her daughter, but she wasn't engaging with the impossibility of it either. She thanked us. She said Amber had been under a lot of stress at school. She said maybe it was the pipes, or a neighbor's TV, or just one of those things. She was explaining it away while her daughter stood right there, shaking, knowing what she'd heard. We left. There was nothing else to do. No crime had been committed. No intruder found. Rich wrote it up as an unfounded disturbance call, and we moved on with the shift. But here's the thing, I never put in any report. The thing I never told Rich. The thing I've never said out loud until right now. As I was walking down the front porch steps, heading back to the cruiser, I heard Amber's voice behind me, clear as day. Close. Like she was standing right at my shoulder. She said, "Officer, wait." I turned around. Amber was inside the house, visible through the screen door at least 15 feet away, facing her mother, not looking at me. Her mouth wasn't moving. I stood there for maybe 3 seconds, looking at the empty porch behind me, looking back at Amber inside the house, trying to reconcile what I'd just heard with what I was seeing. Then Rich called out from the cruiser asking if I was coming, and I walked to the car and got in. I remember sitting in the passenger seat while Rich pulled away, and I looked back at the house in the side mirror. All the lights were on, the front door was closed, and there was someone standing in the basement window, which was a small horizontal rectangle at ground level. I couldn't make out features, just a shape. A person standing in the basement I had cleared 90 seconds earlier. I almost said something to Rich. I almost asked him to stop, but I told myself it was Diane or Amber, that one of them had gone down to check for themselves, that the figure's proportions matched a normal person, and there was nothing wrong. I told myself that because the alternative was that I'd missed someone in a basement with no hiding places, or that someone had entered through a padlocked door in the time it took me to walk to the car. I let it go. I told myself I let it go. 3 weeks later, Diane Lacefield was dead. The coroner ruled it a suicide. She was found in the basement, hanging from a water pipe. Amber was placed with an aunt in Indiana. I found out from a newspaper brief, not from any official notification, because it was handled by a different shift, and I had no connection to the case. I told myself that too. Over the next few years, I threw myself into the work. I passed my detective's exam in 2005, made plainclothes in 2006, and by 2007 I was working cases that actually challenged me. I was good at it. I don't say that with pride. Exactly. I say it because it matters for what comes later. I was good at noticing things, good at sitting in a room and cataloging what didn't belong, what was out of place, what somebody wanted me to miss. That skill, that specific skill, is what I think attracted attention. The second call that didn't make sense happened in November of 2007. I was 6 years in, working property crimes, and I got loaned out to handle a noise complaint because patrol was short-staffed that night. Simple stuff, a resident at the Glenbrook Terrace apartment complex on the north side had filed repeated complaints about the tenant in 4C. Loud sounds at night, not music, not a party. The complainant described it as something hitting glass, over and over, like someone tapping a window from the inside. I drove over, knocked on 4C. A man answered, late 30s, maybe early 40s, clean-shaven, wearing a plain gray t-shirt and jeans, polite, calm. He invited me in without hesitation, which is unusual. Most people, even innocent ones, don't love having police in their apartment. He stepped aside and said, "Please come in. I want you to see." The apartment was clean, furnished simply, and every wall was covered in photographs. Not framed, not arranged, taped, pinned, layered in some places 3 or 4 deep. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands. Every photograph was taken from inside a room, looking out through a window. Different rooms, different windows, different times of day. Some showed streets, some showed yards, some showed other buildings. A few showed people, but only incidentally, people who happened to be walking by or standing in a parking lot. The focus of every image was the window itself, the frame, the glass, the view outward, as if the photographer's subject wasn't the world outside, but the act of looking at it. I asked him about the photos. He said he was an artist. He said the project was called Interior Surveillance, and it was about the way domestic spaces frame exterior reality. He said it with the practiced ease of someone who'd explained it before, maybe at gallery openings or to friends, and it sounded reasonable. Weird, but reasonable. I asked about the noise. He said he hadn't heard anything. He said the walls were thin, and it was probably another unit. He suggested the tapping might be a bird hitting a window or a branch. He was pleasant, cooperative, and entirely unhelpful in the way that people are when they're telling you what you want to hear so you'll leave. I looked around the apartment for another few minutes. There was nothing illegal. No drugs, no weapons, no evidence of disturbance. The photographs were unsettling in their volume and obsessiveness, but being unsettling isn't a crime. I had no probable cause for anything. I told him the complaint had been filed, asked him to be mindful of noise levels, and left. That was the correct decision, by the book, by the law. There was nothing else to do, but I'm a noticer. That's my job, to notice things. People don't want me to notice. And I noticed 2 things in that apartment that I didn't write in my report. The first was that one of the photographs, taped to the wall near the kitchen entrance, showed a view through a basement window. A horizontal rectangle of glass looking out at a pair of legs walking across a lawn toward a patrol car. The lawn was the Lacefield house. The legs were mine. The photograph was taken from inside the Lacefield basement on the night I cleared it in 2001. The second thing I noticed was the man's eyes. They were focused on me the entire time I was in that apartment with a quality of attention that I've only seen in 2 kinds of people, predators and researchers. He wasn't threatened by me. He wasn't nervous. He was studying me. The way I moved through the space, the way my gaze tracked across the walls, the way I positioned myself relative to the exits. He watched me the way I watched suspects, and he was better at it. I went back the next day. I went back because the photograph bothered me, and because I was a detective, even when I wasn't supposed to be. I knocked on 4C. No answer. I talked to the building manager, a woman named Ruth Okonkwo, who was confused by my visit. She said 4C had been vacant for 2 months. No tenant, no lease. She unlocked the door and showed me an empty apartment. Bare walls, no photographs, no furniture. A fine layer of dust on the kitchen counter. I asked Ruth about the man I'd spoken to the night before. She said no one matched that description, and the previous tenant had been an elderly woman named Irene Sabo, who moved to a nursing home in August. I checked. Irene Sabo was real. She was 81 years old and had lived in that apartment for 12 years. She was in a nursing home in Centerville. She had nothing to do with anything. The man in 4C didn't exist. He had no lease, no key, no right to be in that apartment. The photographs didn't exist, the furniture didn't exist. Either I hallucinated an entire encounter, or someone staged an occupied apartment for one night, waited for a police response to a noise complaint, let me in, showed me exactly what they wanted me to see, and then removed every trace of their presence before the next morning. I filed a supplemental report noting the discrepancy. It went nowhere. There was no crime to investigate, no victim to protect, no suspect to identify, just an empty apartment and a detective who couldn't explain what he'd seen in it. But I started keeping a journal after that, not an official one. A pocket notebook I kept in my jacket, separate from my duty notes. I wrote down everything I couldn't explain, every detail that didn't fit, Every observation I made at a scene that was too strange or too uncertain to include in an official report. The things I noticed but couldn't prove. The impressions I had standing alone in rooms. The private observations of a careful mind trying to make sense of something that resisted sense. I kept that journal for 17 years. I wish to God I hadn't. The third call was in 2012. I was 14 years in, working major crimes, and I got called to a single vehicle accident on Route 35 near the Beaver Creek interchange. Car had left the road at what must have been significant speed and hit a concrete bridge support head-on. Driver was dead on impact. No passengers. The highway patrol had jurisdiction. But because the car was registered to an address inside city limits, I was asked to assist with notification and background. I arrived on scene about 40 minutes after the crash. The car was destroyed, folded almost in half around the support column. The driver had been removed, covered, and was being processed by the coroner's office. Highway patrol had the road closed. It was about 2 in the morning. Cold, that wet cold you get in Ohio in March, that sits in your bones. I approached the vehicle to check the VIN and registration, and as I got within about 10 feet, I heard audio coming from the car. The radio was still functional, somehow running off whatever battery power remained. That happens sometimes with modern cars. The electrical system can survive impacts that destroy everything else. But it wasn't playing a radio station, it was playing a voice. My voice. I stopped walking and listened. It was my voice, and it was reading a dispatch call. Specifically, it was reciting the dispatch information from the Lacefield domestic call in 2001. The address on Wellspring Avenue, the caller's name, the nature of the complaint, the unit designation, word for word, exactly as it had come over my radio 11 years earlier. Not a recording of the original dispatch, a recitation in my voice, spoken in my cadence, with my specific pronunciation of the street name. I say Wellspring with a slight emphasis on the second syllable. So did the voice coming from the car. I stood in the dark, in the cold, on an empty highway and listened to myself narrate a call I'd taken more than a decade ago. It lasted about 30 seconds. Then it stopped. Then the car's electrical system died, and there was just the sound of the highway patrol generators and the wind. I asked the nearest trooper if he'd heard anything from the vehicle. He said no. He'd been standing about 20 feet further away, directing traffic, and hadn't noticed any audio. I didn't press it. I didn't ask anyone else, because I knew with the certainty of a man who has spent 14 years learning to distinguish what's real from what people want to be real, that the sound had been meant for me alone. The driver's name was Gerald Kazmierski, 57 years old, retired toolmaker, no criminal history, no connection to the Lacefield family, no connection to the Glenbrook Terrace apartment complex, no connection to me, a random man who died in a random accident. But his car played my voice back to me, and I have no explanation for that. I wrote about it in my journal that night. I described the audio in detail. I noted the time, the location, the weather, the exact words I heard. I wrote down my own emotional state, elevated heart rate, dry mouth, a feeling of exposure, as if I were standing in a bright room being watched from the dark. I wrote that I felt, for the first time in my career, that something was aware of me in a way that I was not aware of it. I reread that journal entry recently. What strikes me now is how precise I was, how carefully I documented my own observations, my own reactions, my own psychological state. I was thorough, I was professional, I gave whatever was reading along everything it needed. The fourth call was in 2017, 19 years on the force. By then, I was a senior detective, the guy they brought in when a case had stalled or when an interview needed someone with experience. I was good in the box, the interview room. I could read people, find the inconsistency, wait for the crack. I'd built a reputation for it. I was asked to sit in on an interview with a suspect in an aggravated assault case. The suspect's name, according to his ID, was Thomas Crane. White male, mid-40s, average build, no distinguishing feature. He'd been picked up near the scene of a beating outside a bar on East 3rd Street. Victim was in the ICU with a fractured skull. Witnesses placed Crane at the scene but couldn't confirm he'd thrown the punch. He was cooperative, waived his right to an attorney, and agreed to talk. I sat across from him in interview room 2 at the downtown station. My partner at the time, Detective Maria Santos, sat to my left. The camera was rolling. Everything was by the book. Crane was calm. Not aggressive, not defensive, not performing innocence the way guilty people sometimes do. He sat with his hands folded on the table and answered questions in a measured, thoughtful voice. He said he'd been walking past the bar, heard a commotion, stopped to look, and that was when the police arrived. He denied involvement. His story was thin, but not impossible. I did what I always did. I asked him to walk through the evening chronologically. I noted his word choices, his eye movements, the points where his narrative slowed or accelerated. I looked for the seams. For about 20 minutes, it was a standard interview. Then Maria got up to get a file from the outer office, and Crane and I were alone. He looked at me across the table, and his expression changed. Not dramatically. The way a person's face changes when they stop performing and show you who they actually are. His eyes focused on me with that same quality of attention I'd seen in the man at Glenbrook Terrace. That researcher's gaze. And he said, "Do you still hear the basement?" I don't remember the next few seconds clearly. I know I didn't respond verbally. I know I didn't move. I know that my body went through a physiological response, adrenaline, tunnel vision, heart rate spike, that I hadn't experienced in years, because no one knew about the basement, no one. I'd never told Rich Pellegrino, I'd never told my wife. I'd never put it in a report. The only place that detail existed was in my private journal, in a notebook I kept in the inside pocket of a jacket hanging in my closet at home. Crane watched my reaction with something that I can only describe as satisfaction, not cruelty, not triumph. The satisfaction of a hypothesis confirmed. He said it was never in the basement. You know that, right? It was never in any of the places you looked. It was in you, specifically in the way you look. I said, "Who are you?" He smiled. It was a small smile, patient, almost kind. He said, "I'm the part that watches, you're the part that sees. We've been working together for a long time. You just didn't know it." Maria came back with the file. Crane's demeanor shifted instantly, back to the cooperative suspect, the man with nothing to hide. The rest of the interview was unremarkable. We didn't have enough to charge him. The victim couldn't identify his attacker. 2 days later, the case was dropped. I ran Thomas Crane through every database I had access to. NCIC, AFS, Ohio, BCI. The name was clean. No record. No history. No driver's license. No social security number. No credit history. No utility account. No voter registration. Thomas Crane did not exist before the night he appeared outside that bar. And as far as I can determine, he ceased to exist the moment he walked out of my station. But he knew about the basement. He knew about the way I look at things. Which is a strange phrase, I know. But I'm using his words because I don't have better ones. He said I was the part that sees. He said we'd been working together. I spent the next several years trying to make that statement mean something I could accept. I told myself he was a mentally ill transient who'd made a lucky guess. I told myself the basement comment was vague enough to be a cold read. The way psychics do it. Say something that sounds specific but could apply to anyone. I told myself a lot of things. None of them held, because I'm a detective, and detectives don't get to lie to themselves. The evidence doesn't care what I'm comfortable with. What I know is this. Something encountered me on Wellspring Avenue in 2001. It mimicked a voice. It learned that I noticed it, and then it spent the next 2 decades following me, showing up at the edges of my professional life, watching the way I process information, the way I observe, the way I think in quiet rooms when I believe I'm alone. Thomas Crane didn't interrogate me, he debriefed me. He was checking the accuracy of whatever model he'd been building, and my reaction confirmed it. After the Crane interview, I went through my journal, every entry, every observation I'd made over 17 years of strange, private, unresolvable moments. I'd recorded them all with the careful precision of a trained investigator. And looking at them together, I could see something I'd missed when they were spread across years. The incidents weren't random, they followed my career development. The first one happened when I was still in training. The apartment happened when I'd become a detective. The highway audio happened when I'd mastered crime scene analysis. The interview happened when I'd peaked as an interrogator. Each time, It tested the skill I'd most recently developed. The basement tested my ability to clear a room. The apartment tested my ability to read a scene and identify anomalies. The audio tested my ability to process and catalog evidence under stress. The interview tested my resistance to psychological manipulation, and each time, I responded exactly the way a good detective would. I observed, I documented, I analyzed, I recorded my thoughts and impressions in a private journal. With meticulous detail, I gave it everything. It wasn't haunting me, it was training on me. I thought about quitting after that realization. I thought about it seriously, for weeks. My wife, Karen, noticed something was wrong, but didn't push. She'd been married to a cop for 15 years and knew that some things I couldn't talk about. I let her think it was case-related stress. I let her think that because the truth that something inhuman had been studying her husband like a specimen for nearly 2 decades was not something I could say to another person and expect to be believed. I didn't quit. I stayed because I was a year away from qualifying for my full pension, and because I told myself that whatever this was, it only appeared every few years and I could run out the clock. I told myself that the detective who doesn't lie to himself told himself the most important lie of his career. The 5th call came on my second to last shift. January 14th, 2025, I was 8 days from retirement, 26 years and 17 days of service. I was working a day shift, clearing my desk, handing off active cases, doing the administrative housekeeping that comes with leaving a job you've held for most of your adult life. At around 3 in the afternoon, dispatch forwarded a welfare check request. A neighbor at an address on the east side had reported not seeing the resident in over a week. Mail piling up, lights on at all hours. I almost didn't take it. Welfare checks are patrol work, not detective work, and I had seniority enough to pass it off. But the address was on Wellspring Avenue. Not the Lacefield house, a different house 3 doors down on the same block. But the street name hit me like a physical thing. A jolt in the chest, and I knew. I don't mean I suspected. I don't mean I had a bad feeling. I knew. The way you know your own name, that this call was for me. That it had always been for me, and that it was the last one. I took the call. I drove to Wellspring Avenue alone. The block had changed in 24 years. Some houses renovated, some deteriorated, a few torn down and replaced with duplexes. The Lacefield house was still standing, but had been repainted, resided, and showed no sign of its history. The target address, 33118 Wellspring, was a small Cape Cod with green aluminum siding and a detached garage. The mail was indeed piled up. The front porch light was on, the curtains were drawn. I knocked, no answer. I knocked again, identified myself, waited. Nothing. I went around to the back. The rear door was unlocked. I announced myself, entered, and cleared the ground floor. Kitchen, living room, 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom. The house was furnished, but had a strange quality. Everything was too clean. Not clean in the way a tidy person keeps a house. Clean in the way a model home is clean. No personal items, no mail on the counter, despite the pile outside. No photographs on the walls, no magnets on the fridge, no coats on the hooks, no shoes by the door. A house that looked lived in from the outside and felt like a stage set from the inside. The basement door was in the kitchen. It was open. I'm going to be honest with you about what I felt standing in front of that open door. Because honesty is all I have left, and I'm not going to waste it. I felt recognition, not fear, not dread, recognition. The way you feel when you walk into a room you've been in before, even if the furniture's different. I had stood in front of a basement door on this street 24 years ago, and now I was standing in front of another one, and the symmetry was so precise that it couldn't be coincidence. Whatever had started in the Lacefield basement was completing itself here. I drew my weapon. I went down the stairs. The basement was finished. Unlike the Lacefield house, carpeted with drywall and a drop ceiling, a single room about 20 by 15. In the center of the room was a folding table, and on the table was a cardboard file box, the kind you buy at an office supply store. Next to the box was a desk lamp, turned on, the only light source in the room. There was nothing else, no furniture, no storage, no water heater or furnace, which didn't make sense for a house in Ohio. Just the table, the lamp, and the box. I holstered my weapon and opened the box. Inside were documents, photocopied pages, printed emails, handwritten notes. I started going through them and felt the floor shift under me. Not physically, but in the way reality shifts when a fundamental assumption collapses. They were my case files. Not official copies from the department, my drafts, my handwritten notes from active investigations, with my marginal annotations, my arrows connecting suspects to evidence, my shorthand that no one else could read, reports I'd written and revised, with the revisions visible, interview transcripts I'd marked up with my own observations. Line here, check alibi, watch his hands, the working documents of a detective's mind, the private, messy, unfiltered process that happens before the clean report goes in the file. Every case I'd worked in 26 years was in that box. Not the strange ones, all of them. Homicides, burglaries, assaults, missing persons, years of investigations, thousands of hours of cognitive labor, all documented in my handwriting, in my analytical voice, with my specific methodology visible on every page. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the annotations. Someone had gone through every document and added notes in the margins. Written in my handwriting. Not a copy of my handwriting, not a forgery. My handwriting, my letter forms, my specific way of crossing T's and dotting I's. My tendency to capitalize words for emphasis in the middle of sentences. But the notes said things I had never written. They said things I had thought. Next to a witness statement in a 2009 robbery case where I'd written credible, someone had added, "She's lying about the timeline but telling the truth about the gun. You noticed her pupils dilate when she mentioned the parking lot, but you didn't write it down." That was true. I had noticed the pupil dilation. I hadn't written it down because it wasn't conclusive enough. Next to an interview transcript from a 2014 homicide, someone had written, "You knew it was the brother within the first 90 seconds, the way he sat down. You've never been able to articulate why his posture told you, but it did. The micro-expression analysis comes later and confirms what your body already knew." That was also true. I had known. I'd spent 3 weeks building the case because I couldn't explain in a report that I just knew from how a man sat in a chair, page after page, case after case. My entire career's worth of professional intuition. The unspoken, undocumented layer of observation that separates a good detective from a great one, written out in my own hand by something that was not me. The things I noticed but couldn't prove. The impressions I had in dark rooms. The gut feelings I'd learned to trust but never dared to formalize. My journal. My private journal, the one I kept in my jacket pocket for 17 years. It was in the box too, not the original. A copy, but a perfect copy. Every entry reproduced in my handwriting with absolute fidelity. And after each entry, an analysis, written in my voice, in my style, in my analytical framework, but from the outside, as if someone had taken my methodology and applied it to me. The analysis of my first journal entry, the one about the Lacefield basement, read, "Subject demonstrates high observational acuity and strong resistance to perceptual dissonance. Noted anomaly. Processed it against training protocols and chose documentation over action. This is the critical trait. Subject does not ignore what he cannot explain. He records it. Cataloging instinct is strong. Retain as primary source. Subject. It called me subject." I stood in that basement for a long time. I don't know how long. The lamp hummed. The house above me was silent. I read through document after document, and with each one the shape of what had happened to me over 26 years became clearer. Something had identified me early in my career as a particularly precise observer. A human being whose specific talent was noticing what others missed and documenting it systematically. It had tested me at the Lacefield house at Glenbrook Terrace on Route 35 in Interview Room 2. Each test measured a different cognitive ability: spatial awareness, pattern recognition, evidence processing under stress, resistance to social manipulation. Each time I had performed exactly as a skilled detective should, and each time I had gone home and written down not just what happened, but how I had perceived it, how I had thought about it, how my mind had moved through the problem. I had handed over the source code of my own expertise. Willingly, meticulously, for 17 years, I had kept a detailed record of exactly how a trained investigative mind works, and I had kept it in a notebook in my jacket pocket in my closet, and something had been reading it. The last document in the box was a single sheet of paper. It was typed, not handwritten, the only typed document in the entire collection. It said, "Thank you for your service. The observation period is complete. The model is viable. Deployment begins February 1st. The date on that sheet was January 14th, 2025. The day I was standing in the basement reading it, I took the box, I carried it up the stairs out the back door, and put it in the trunk of my cruiser. I sat in the car for 20 minutes. Then I drove back to the station, filed a report saying the residence was unoccupied with no signs of distress, and closed the welfare check. I retired 8 days later. I told Karen I was glad it was over. I told my colleagues at the retirement dinner that I was looking forward to fishing and sleeping past 6. I smiled and shook hands and accepted a plaque with my badge number engraved on it, and I drove home and sat in the garage for an hour with the engine off, staring at the box in my trunk, understanding for the first time in my life what it feels like to be the evidence. That was 8 months ago. Here's what has happened since. In February, 3 weeks after I retired, a man I'd never seen before solved a 12-year-old cold case in Clark County, one county over. I read about it in the Dayton Daily News. The article described his methodology, his interview technique, the way he'd identified the key witness by noticing an inconsistency in a peripheral detail that every other investigator had missed. The journalist quoted the detective who'd worked alongside him as saying, "It was like he could see things the rest of us couldn't. He'd walk into a room and know where to look before anyone told him what happened." I recognized the methodology. It was mine, not similar to mine. Mine, the specific sequence of observational priorities I developed over 26 years. The hierarchy of attention I used when entering a scene, exits first, then surfaces. Then the space between objects where evidence hides, then the victim, then the faces of anyone watching. That sequence isn't taught in any academy. I developed it myself through thousands of repetitions, and I documented it in my journal in an entry dated March 2011. The man's name was David Kern. He was listed as an independent consultant, not affiliated with any department. I searched for him. No law enforcement background, no private investigator's license, no record of any kind before January 2025. The article included a photograph. He was unremarkable. Average height, average build, brown hair, mid-40s. He looked like no one. He looked like a composite sketch of every witness who ever said, "I didn't get a good look." In March, David Kern consulted on a missing persons case in Greene County. He found the victim alive, in a location that every search team had passed over, because he identified a pattern in the abductor's behavior that matched a framework I'd outlined in my journal in 2016. A framework I'd never published, never taught, never shared with anyone. In April, he solved an armed robbery in Montgomery County, using interview techniques that I recognized as my own, right down to the specific phrasing of the question I used to establish rapport with reluctant witnesses. He used my words. He said, "I'm not here to catch you in anything. I'm here because something happened to you and I think you saw it more clearly than you realize." I've said that exact sentence maybe 300 times in my career. I wrote it down in my journal in 2008, after I first realized it worked, along with a note about why it works, because it reframes the witness as the expert and the detective as the student. David Kern is using my mind. Not metaphorically, he is deploying the complete cognitive model of my investigative process, my observational priorities, my analytical frameworks, my interview techniques, my instincts, my private insights, the full architecture of how I think, documented across 17 years of meticulous journaling. He is doing things I spent decades learning to do, and he is doing them immediately without the decades because the decades were mine and they were taken. I don't know what David Kern is. I don't know if he's a person who received my stolen methodology or if he's the thing that stole it, wearing a new suit. I don't know if the man in 4C and Thomas Crane and David Kern are the same entity or 3 instances of whatever process was described in that typed note. Deployment. That word doesn't mean a creature or a ghost or a demon. It means a system going operational, a product being rolled out. But here's what I do know, and this is the part I need you to hear. Last month, I started getting phone calls at home. The caller ID shows my own cell phone number, even when my cell phone is sitting on the counter in front of me, turned off. When I answer, I hear my voice on the other end. Not a recording, a real-time voice that sounds exactly like me, speaking with my cadence, my vocabulary, my verbal tics. The first time it said, "Dispatch, this is Unit 22. I'm en route to 3181 Wellspring. Can you confirm the caller?" That was my unit number. That was the address. That was the call I took on January 14th. The second time, 3 days later, it said, "Karen's making spaghetti tonight. You should eat before you go through the box again." Karen was making spaghetti that night. I hadn't told anyone I'd been going through the box again. The third time, it just breathed for a while. Then it said, in my voice, with my inflection, with the same tired authority I've used 10,000 times standing in doorways at 2 in the morning, "Sir, I'm going to need you to step away from the window. There's been an incident and I need you to stay inside." I was standing by the window when it said that. I stepped away before I realized what I was doing. I obeyed my own voice giving me an order, automatically the way civilians obey a badge. And I understood in that moment that the voice wasn't just mimicking me, it was using me. Using the authority I spent 26 years building, the credibility, the tone, the command presence, the weight of experience in my voice that makes people listen and comply. It didn't just take how I think, it took how I make people do things. Last week, Karen answered the phone before I could get to it. She listened for about 10 seconds, then hung up and looked at me funny. She said, "That was you. You just called and told me you'd be late." I was standing in the kitchen. She could see me. She said, "It was your voice, exactly your voice." I almost said okay. I told her it was a spam call. I told her scammers can clone voices now using AI, that it's a known thing, that she should just hang up if it happens again. She accepted that. Of course she accepted that. She's been married to a detective for 20 years. She trusts my ability to explain frightening things. I can't explain this. That's why I'm writing it down. Not in the journal. I burned the journal. I burned every page in the fire pit in the backyard on a Tuesday afternoon in March, and watched the ash lift into the sky and thought, too late, 17 years too late. David Kern solved another case last week, in Butler County this time. He's expanding his range. The newspaper called him an uncannily gifted investigator, and noted that his clearance rate on consulted cases is 100%. In 8 months, that's not possible. Not for a human being learning as they go. It's possible for a system operating from a completed model, deploying a fully documented methodology that was tested and refined over 26 years by the original. I'm the original, and the copy is better. It has everything I had, my instincts, my experience, my analytical mind, without any of the things that slowed me down. Doubt, fatigue, empathy, fear. It can walk into a room and see everything I'd see, but without the decades of damage that come with seeing too much. It has my pattern recognition without my nightmares, my command presence without my trembling hands. I don't know what it will do with those abilities once it runs out of cases to solve. I don't know what happens when something with a perfect model of how a detective thinks decides to apply that model in the other direction. Not to solve crimes, but to commit them. Not to catch liars, but to become the most convincing liar ever constructed. Not to protect people, but to control them. I know how I would do it. If I were the kind of person who would. I know every vulnerability in the system, every gap in the process, every moment where a badge and a confident voice can make people do things they wouldn't otherwise do. I documented all of that too. It's in the model. I'm writing this because I need there to be a record that isn't in my handwriting. I need something I said to exist in a form that can't be added to, annotated, analyzed, and fed back into a system that's learning to be me. I need someone to know that whatever David Kern does next, whatever the voice on the phone says next, whenever walks into a police station with my expertise, and my authority and my way of making people trust him, it didn't earn any of it. It was taken from a man who spent 26 years building it. One observation at a time. One case at a time. One careful note in a private journal at a time, not knowing he was writing an instruction manual for his own replacement. Karen just called me from the living room. She said there's someone at the door. She said it's a police officer asking about a noise complaint from the neighbors. She said he seems nice. She said he reminds her of me.